Hello, this is IP Stories by 4IP Council, a podcast about innovation and intellectual property. Join us and you'll hear about the journeys through invention, creation, and IP understanding of our guests.
Hi, everybody. I'm Valéria Silva, member of the advisory committee of 4IP Council, a research think tank specialized on intellectual property rights in Brussels. We are excited to host today in our new episode, Joff Wild. Joff is well known for his wide expertise as a journalist in the field of intellectual property, especially as editor in chief of IM, a post he held from 2003 until his recent retirement at the end of last year. He kindly agreed to share some of his large experience and reflections on benefits, challenges, and perspectives for companies as they navigate the digital economy. Joff, it's a great pleasure to have you here today. How
Yeah,
are
it's
you?
great to be here. I'm very well, thank you, and it's great to be talking to you, Valeria.
So let me start by asking you to explain a bit to those that are listening to us right now. What is IM?
So, IAM is intellectual asset management, and it's an online platform now. It used to be a magazine, but it's an online platform now that focuses on looking at intellectual property as a business asset. So, how you use IP to create value in a business, and we've been going for since 2003. So this year is our 20th anniversary, if you can believe it.
Yeah, you've been very successful. And actually, I would like to ask you what opportunities throughout your career have you identified in the IP market that led you to create IAM, which is now a major source of IP information and analysis for businesses in general?
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing about IP is that it was always, from a journalistic and editorial perspective, it was always reported on as about the law.
Mm,
So here's a court decision, here's a new law introduced by this country. This is a new regulation,
mm,
and it was seen very much as something that was interesting for lawyers. But I came into IP, and that's how I started reporting it as well. But then it
mm,
became pretty obvious to me that IP was actually a lot more than that.
mm,
And the way in which you use IP can actually have a fundamental effect on your profitability, on the
mm,
amount of money that you generate, on your ability to form partnerships with other companies,
mm,
even to go out and get finance. But no one was reporting about that. No one was analysing that. No one was providing any data on any of that from a
mm.
journalistic perspective. So I just thought, look, there's an opportunity here. Let's do something that no one else is doing, um, and see if it works. And we launched at a perfect time, and we began growing very very quickly, and it went from there. IP is
Mhm.
a fundamental business asset and a driver of the 21st century economy. I'm sure you agree, don't you?
Yeah, definitely. And you were the first one to spot that actually IP is a major asset for all businesses. And I think that has even become more evident nowadays with the digital economy. So you saw
Absolutely.
that way earlier than everybody.
Well, I think maybe I was. What I'll say is I was probably one of the first journalists to see that, but
Uh-huh.
there were other people that saw it in business before me, and that's what enabled us to create the product because there
Hmm.
were things to report on, there were people to interview, there was data to publicise. It's just that no journalists had picked up on it before,
We're
and yeah,
doing
so
that.
it was a great opportunity, And when you see an opportunity like that, you got to
Yeah.
go for it.
Yeah, definitely. And since we actually care about a lot of how SMEs can develop their business and
Yeah,
their IP assets, and actually IAM at its inception was an SME.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, so as such, you understand really well the constraints of SMEs. And what then do you see as major challenges faced by them nowadays when they have to navigate the evolving and fast-moving digital economy?
Yeah. Well, I would say rather them than me. That would be that's the way I see it. Yeah, I mean, IEM was undoubtedly an SME. Probably still is actually, even though it's
Mhm,
part of a bigger business now. What I remember about the early days was you are working 7 days a week. You are
mhm,
working 12, 15, 18 hours every day of the week. You have to be absolutely focused on income and how much money that you're making and controlling your expenditure, and you haven't got time to think half the time. You're just doing stuff,
mhm,
and you can't take a step back and think, oh, what can we do next month, next year? It's just
mhm.
staying alive day after day that's important. um, and in the digital economy now, that's all speeded up
Yeah,
1,000 times
yeah.
more than it used to be. I mean, as well as me, we're talking. Where are you at the moment? You're in France or Portugal or somewhere?
I'm in France.
Yeah, and I'm in the UK, and we're talking to each other.
Yeah,
You couldn't do that 20 years ago,
that's
but
true.
now you can. So there's an advantage there, but there's also a lot of challenges that poses. And I think that's the thing about the digital economy, is it has kind of made the world smaller and opened up so many more opportunities as a result. But consequently, along with along with opportunities, you get challenges. And so,
Mhm.
there's probably more that's going through the heads of people running SMEs now than was the case 20 years ago.
And
And
less time to even reflect about how to react to all those changes, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, you still got to be making your money every day. You still got to be have to meet payroll requirements and all of that kind of stuff. But now you have to think about regulations not only in your home jurisdiction, but in all the other jurisdictions in which you might be operating or may want to operate in the future. There's all these issues around data that just didn't exist 20 years ago. Um,
Mhm.
so, the optimist in me says that creates so many fantastic opportunities, and I truly believe that. But it inevitably creates challenges that just didn't exist 20 years ago. And the successful businesses, to be serious, the successful SMEs, the ones that are going to scale up and grow and survive, are the ones that understand that. Are the ones that even in that incredibly busy 24-hour day that you have, it's those businesses whose leaders can take the step back and can look at the wider scenarios and can understand how their business fits into them. Those are the ones that are going to be successful.
And since you mentioned the national regulations, now we see that there is a multitude of different policies and strategies adopted by different countries around the world. And so, how do you see that? What do you see as the major trends that actually could affect SMEs in relations to what kind of policies are coming up and strategies by countries that could affect the SMEs?
Yeah, well, I think in terms of policy, the really big one
Mhm.
from an IP perspective, and we're talking about IP, I think the really big one is the birth of the unitary patent system in Europe.
Mhm.
For me, that is a massive potential game changer, not just for big businesses, but for small businesses as well.
Mm.
There's been a lot of focus on the unified patent call, but
Mhm.
for SMEs in particular, I think that the unitary patent is the one that is of potentially game changing significance. So for the first time in Europe, you have a situation where you can get protection with one application in 17 jurisdictions. And those
Mm.
17 jurisdictions cover 400 million people.
Mm.
You know, three, I think, G7 economies, many more G20 economies. This is an incredibly wealthy, economically sophisticated, technologically advanced part of the world, and you get one patent and it covers all 17, covers 17 countries. Now, in terms of an SME going out and looking for funding, that is a very powerful prospectus. You know, we
Because
have
it
patents, we have patents covering this, and these are enforceable patents that, if it came to it, we could go to court and get very significant remedies in cases of infringement. And for me, that's a big game changer. I mean, I don't know what you think, but I think that takes Europe forward a long way from where it has been.
Yeah, because so I think that Europe is actually making it's streamlining at least this patent application system to make it less costly for the SMEs and also easier for them to actually go after the infringement of their patents, which was mostly done before just by the bigger companies that had more financial means to go after that, right? That's what.
Yeah, I think that's right. But it's for me, it's even more than that.
Mm,
Because you can do that, you're creating an asset. And if you compare a unitary patent to a patent granted in the United States, for example, the US is an incredibly important. Well, it's the
market.
world's single biggest economy. It's a vital market. But you can't enforce patents in the US in the way that you can in Europe. You can't, for example, if you enforce a patent in Europe and you win and you prevail in court, the likelihood is you'll get an injunction. So you can actually stop the losing defendant, from marketing their product, selling their product in the relevant jurisdiction. You
Mm,
don't get injunctions in the United States anymore. So even though the patent is very powerful, the patent covers a very big market in the US,
mm,
it doesn't have the power to actually prevent people from operating in the US. Whereas the unitary patent, you've got 400 million people covered, and you've also got the injunction if you're successful. And for me, that creates a level of power and value that you can't find anywhere else in the world. And that for me is very, very significant.
And in your opinion, since you mentioned this difference, why don't you get any more these enforcement injunctions in the US? Since it's a country that has always supported innovation and supported patents
Yeah,
throughout its history.
I agree. And it's for me, it is, one of the big things that we've monitored over the time that I was at IAM, and I'm sure my sort of the people that are there now are doing the same now, is how the US has decided to kind of reevaluate the way in which they see patents. The right to exclude in the US no longer exists,
Mm,
and that's pretty fundamental. And it goes back to, I don't want to get all technical, but there was a big court case called eBay versus Merck Exchange, decided at the Supreme Court in, I think, 2005, where
mm,
the Supreme Court ruled that injunctions shouldn't be automatically granted to winning plaintiffs, that you had to prove a level of harm before you got the injunction. And it's proved, it's now very, very difficult to prove that level of harm, to the point where you basically can't. And what's driven that? I think there's been a very powerful narrative in the United States that patents are being abused, that there
mm,
are bad faith players and they are causing a lot of harm, and they are harming SMEs. And this narrative, in my opinion, has been driven primarily by big companies that implement other people's technologies in their products.
mm,
What's very interesting, in my view, is that they have not done that by saying this is harming us. They've created a narrative where it's harming SMEs. So
mm,
they're saying we've got to get rid of injunctions, we've got to get rid of this, we've got to get rid of all these protections that we used to have because it hurts SMEs. And they haven't
mm,
actually, in my view, provided much evidence of that. But it's been very successful. and in the United States. And I think there is a danger that that same narrative is going to come over to Europe if people in Europe aren't careful about it. And for me, that could cause a huge amount of damage. And it's one of the things that concerns me about the way that patent policy is going in Europe globally.
And since you mentioned damages and the different regulations that the SMEs face in different jurisdictions, could you share your advice on how the SMEs they could ensure that they are protecting their IP portfolio in the most efficient manner in view of these various regulations? And in different countries and different policies that they have to deal with if they want to actually market their products or services abroad.
Yeah, I would say, first of all, I'm a journalist. I'm not a lawyer, so I could be talking a load of nonsense here. So do not rely on my words for legal advice. This is not legal advice. I think the big issue with SMEs is that most SMEs don't actually realise what intellectual property they own in the first place. I think the first thing that an SME needs to do is actually identify what is the intellectual property they have and what is the intellectual property they could have if they wanted to. So it's not just about, you might have some copyrights, you might own a brand or what have you. What is it that we could create if we decided to?
So it's not that they don't realize the value of their intellectual property rights, it's that they don't even identify what they could protect.
Exactly. Yeah. I think, in my view, I'm as I say, I'm not a lawyer, but look, an SME might have a fantastic way of doing something, might have a way of implementing a technology that is much quicker than everyone else's way of doing it. What they have there is know-how, and that know-how could be protected as a trade secret, for example. But you need to know that, don't you, before you can actually protect it. You need to know it. Or maybe, there's always this debate about whether we should have trade secrets or patents. But you've got to understand what that debate is before you can make any decision. And I think, for me, a lot of SMEs in Europe, and I'm sure it's the same in Brazil and other parts of the world, just don't even begin to engage. They don't even know the question is there to ask in the first place. And that, for me, is absolutely fundamental. You need to get to the point where you're asking the right people the right questions. You understand their answers. And with those answers, you can then begin to form a strategy. And it's then that you start having to engage with all the regulations and the laws around the world. But, understand what it is first. That would be my primary piece of advice.
Yeah, like it's interesting that you mentioned trade secrets because with the digital economy, software now has mostly been protected as a trade secret.
Yeah.
And AI, so all the technologies that are coming out now, like the companies are usually favoring the protection through trade secret. And I would like to ask you as we approach the end of our conversation, Joff, unfortunately, because it has been really, really a pleasure. But I would like to ask you what would be your final message to the SMEs who want to actually market their products or services here in Europe, taking into account the European market?
Yeah. Well, I think, first of all, have a look at the unitary patent, have a look at the new trade secret legislation that's come in Europe very recently. Those things are all there now, and they're going to help you. For me, though, the really interesting thing about SMEs in Europe, and again, this applies elsewhere, but I think in Europe and the European Union, it's really important, is that SMEs have been identified as the foundation of the European economy. That it's decision makers in Europe believe that what is good for SMEs is good for Europe, and that it's SMEs that are going to deliver the innovation and the technological change that Europe needs in order to stay competitive with the rest of the world. For me, that makes SMEs incredibly powerful politically in IP if they organise. I think what we see at the moment is there's a lot of organisations that say they speak for SMEs, but I'm not convinced that many actually do speak for SMEs. They speak for the people that fund them or the people that are running them or what have you. But if there was a genuine organisation that represented SMEs with regards to intellectual property on a pan-European basis and could demonstrate that they do that, then I think they would be a very powerful voice in Europe. And so I guess if we're going to have one takeaway from this conversation, it's for SMEs to understand just how powerful they are, that it's not big corporations that set the agenda, that need to set the agenda in Europe. If SMEs could be doing it, but I understand how tough that is, and if you're working every day and night and day to make your business function, how much time do you have to do all the policy stuff? But fundamentally, if you can find the time, it would make a really significant difference, I think, to the outlook for SMEs in Europe with regards to intellectual property. So that would be my takeaway.
Joff, it has been really a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Valeria. Great speaking to you. Cheers.
Thank you for listening to IP Stories by 4IP Council. Visit our website on 4ipcouncil.eu to find out more and check out the links mentioned during this episode. If you liked it, remember to share and subscribe.